Hello everybody, and welcome to the video series devoted to the first World Chess Championship match in the history, one played between Johannes Zukertort and Wilhelm Steinitz back in 1886. As mentioned earlier, in this video series, we will analyze every single game that was played in this match. But before we get to the actual games, I would like to go a little bit into the background of the match, introduce the players, introduce their credential, and explain how exactly did this match happen to be, and why exactly was this the very first match that officially was competed for the official title of the World Chess Champion. So, let's dive into it. In the 19th century, the official title of the World Chess Champion didn't really exist, even though there are some indications and there are some sources, according to the very good website Chess History, that there were some unofficial uses of this phrase champion of the world or world champion, but none of it was official. So the general chess public usually considered the most successful tournament and match player to be the strongest in the world. So there was no official title, there was no official cycle, but sort of domination and prevalence was achieved by the consensus of the majority. And in order to get that consensus, one had to be really successful and really competitive player both in tournaments in the matches, which is not so. It is not surprising that throughout the 19th century several chess players were considered to be the very best in the world, most notably the great American genius Paul Charles Morphy before he disappeared, and then some others, for example Adolf Andersen at some point, and so on and so forth. However, in the 1860s and 1870s, another player appeared on the scene, and his name would later become very famous. He was, of course, the Austrian player Wilhelm Steinitz, and due to his numerous successes, he would be considered the strongest chess player at that time. Steinitz first distinguished himself during the 1862 London tournament, one of the historic tournaments of a time, which was won by Adolf Andersen, but where Steinitz took 5th place and played a couple of noteworthy games that were, quite remarkable for the contemporaries and even by today's standards. And immediately after that tournament in London, Steinitz took residence in that city and challenged some of the leading players to matches, because back in the day there were not that many tournaments, so one way of showing your prowess as a player and asserting dominance was beating people in matches. So in 1863 he beat Joseph Henry Blackburn in a match, one of the leading players of that time. And then in 1866 he beat the Bird, the inventor and proponent of 1F4, the famous Bird opening, in a match, and more importantly Adolf Andersen himself in 1866, who at that point was considered to be the strongest player at the time. So Steinitz built upon these successes by beating Zukertort in 1872 very convincingly in the first Steinitz-Zukertort match, although Zukertort was relatively up and coming and much younger back in the day. And then in 1872 he won the London tournament, which was Steinitz's first major tournament victory, and then he built it up by winning the 1873 tournament in Vienna. Finally, everything was confirmed, or his status was reinforced by beating Blackburn again in a match in 1876. So throughout the 60s and early 70s, Steinitz would basically dominate the chess scene and win almost every major competition. However, in 1873, he basically took a hiatus from playing chess. So apart from this match against Blackburn in 1876, he didn't play a single competition basically in 11 years. As you know, in chess, competition never sleeps, even in the 19th century. So during Steinitz's hiatus, other players would take up his role, and in particular one specific player, and his name was Johannes Zukertort, would take on sort of a leading role of that time. So even though he lost a match to Steinitz in 1972, in the second half of the 70s and early 80s, he enjoyed quite a few successes. For example, Zukertort shared second place in the tournament in Leipzig in 1877. He came in clear first in Paris in 1878. He came in second again in Berlin in 1881, And he beat Blackburn in a match in the very same year in 80-81. So by 80-81 it was kinda not clear who the best player is because Steinitz was inactive and Zukertort out of all other names had the best tournament record, although he wasn't as dominant. And then in 80-82 in the Vienna tournament Steinitz came back and actually managed to win tournament with Zukertort coming in 5th. So for the short moment Steinitz confirmed or regained his former glory and the title of the strongest player in the world. However, that reign lasted only for a year, because in the very next year, in 80-83, the historic tournament in London happened, where virtually all the strongest players of a time, including Steinitz, participated, and the tournament turned out to be an enormous success for Zukertort. And sure enough, after such a success and a tournament where he dominated Steinitz, who was previously considered to be the best player ever, even contemporary chess publications started considering Zukertort as a legitimate contender for that very title, not only due to his previous successes, but also due to this most recent one. So for example, the corresponding publication, the Chess Players Chronicle, wrote that it is very certain that Steinitz was, at one time, fairly entitled to the position of champion, and under such circumstances would hold it so long as he could defend himself against all comers. He had just taken an inferior place to Zukertort in a tournament, and for the time being, Zukertort, in the opinion of some, becomes champion. So you can see that, the opinion of the public was very much dependent on the results, although you have to say that if you don't play chess for 11 tournaments and in the meantime the other guy wins all the major events, it is legitimate to consider that other guy as the strongest. So that's why in 80-83 there was like this big question about who actually the strongest is. Is it Zukertort or is it Steinitz? And in order to clarify that and to regain his lost prestige, already immediately after the London tournament, Steinitz challenged Johannes Zukertort to a match to determine who is the best player of the time. However, back in the day, there was no FIDE, there was no World Championship cycle, things weren't that formal. And due to some money issues, due to the questions where the match was actually to be played, because, for example, Steinitz was living in the United States and Zukertort had financial backers back in London, the negotiations for the match were quite protracted and lasted very, very long. So even though the first time the discussion started happened in 80-83, it wouldn't take until 80-86 for the match to actually take place. And actually Zukertort, after prolonged negotiation, agreed to play on Steinitz's home turf in the USA because Steinitz was living there back at the time. Thus, everything was set for the match between the two leading players of the time, Steinitz and Zukertort. However, what distinguished this match and what made it different from all the other previously held matches between leading players in the 19th century was that for the first time the contract of the match included a clause in the very first sentence, nonetheless, that the match was to be played for the championship of the world. And as mentioned previously, even though this term champion of the world champion, and similar phrases were casually thrown throughout the 19th century, this was for the first time that it was included in the actual contract, and this is why this match in particular is considered to be the beginning of the lineage of the World Chess Championship history. It is not entirely clear to me at whose insistence or why was it decided that particularly that moment to include this phrasing. I have read somewhere on the internet, but I haven't managed to officially confirm that it was at the insistence of Steinitz, which would make some sense considering that he probably recognized how loosey-goosey the whole concept of having a public recognize the strongest player of the world is. So he probably felt strongly to have it very formally defined. But in any case, irrespective of how it happened, it did happen, and thus the 80-86 match between Steinitz and Zukertort is officially the first ever World Chess Championship match. So yeah, hopefully this explains how we got there and how it all happened. Of course, this is sort of a shortened version. I definitely recommend you to read several resources on the internet. As mentioned earlier, the website Chess History, led by renowned chess historian Edward Winter and his team, is arguably the best source of all the historical materials, because they actually have literal sources from that time, so corresponding newspapers and articles. I will link to that website in below. If you like this video, you might want to like it and or subscribe or whatever. But in any case, starting from the next video, we will stop all this historical nonsense and actually get going with the chess. And we will dive in the very first game of that historic Steinitz-Zukertort World Championship match. So I hope you enjoyed this one and see you in the next one. Thank you and bye bye.